Thank you for joining us today for an exciting opportunity to learn and discover how open source test tools can support your enterprise testing needs. With us today is Andrew Polner, President and CEO of ALPI International, Pat Quilter, CEO of Quillmont Solutions, an ALPI partner company, and James Koch, a Quillmont IT solutions architect. With over 24 years of enterprise testing solutions and having supported over 1,000 organizations, ALPI brings you the knowledge, tools, and people to make your testing successful. Andrew, why don't you kick us off?
Thank you, Dave. This is Andrew Polner. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to talk to you about a number of things relating to testing and automation and then the specific tools. One thing that you'll definitely get out of this webinar today is an understanding of Appium and Selenium, how they work, how to use them, what some of the challenges are, and how to use them effectively. We're going to do that a little later in the webinar when we have James actually present the tools themselves and show you some of the things that we do with the tools. There are benefits and weaknesses, obviously, to using open source tools. We will describe what those are so you can compare them to tools that you may have already used. And we'll be talking about automation in the software lifecycle, what typically happens, what we see in organizations, and how we can make automation implementation be successful. Finally, we'll be talking about frameworks, automated frameworks, what they are and the benefits to using automated frameworks. So what typically happens in the life cycle of automation? Well, in the early years, what we found is that there's this initial euphoria. You finally got the approval to get some tools, you get the tools, and then, oh my gosh, you look through the documentation and you see thousands of pages of features and different functions, and you wonder, what am I supposed to use here? How am I supposed to work with this? And when you finally figure out how the tool does work, you start doing a basic test and you realize that even on some simple things that you're trying to do with your application, the tool refuses to work. It becomes very frustrating. Now, in the middle years, what happens? Well, you finally figure out how to write some scripts. They're working reliably and consistently. But then, all of a sudden, Friday afternoon, you have plans for the weekend, and you expect that your tests will run over the weekend, only to find out that they're not running. Very frustrating. Then we also find out that the tool itself, because of the programming and the complexity of it, is starting to rival the actual software that you're trying to test. So your scripts are becoming very complex, hard to maintain, and it's really hard to keep up. In the late years, you're really just in disbelief. You've just found out that you've been trying to update your automated scripts to run them to do that final regression, and you just found out that the application was released. Why? Because obviously the automation environment wasn't ready, wasn't prepared, so you're no longer as relevant to the actual testing process. They released without your scripts running. So disillusionment sets in. You're not even, really all that happy about the work you're doing. It doesn't seem to be something that is respected and that's part of the release cycle. So you end up abandoning the automation work. You find another web development project, and you kind of wonder, did anybody even notice? Now, this can happen. We see it does happen, but what we want to make sure is that it doesn't happen to you. So with what we will be talking about today, we'll set you on the right path to automation, to what tools you should be using, how you can use them, and how you can be effective with them. Now, we talked about the word framework early on at the beginning here. And when you think about an automated framework, the question comes to mind is, what is a framework? Is a framework a set of scripts or utilities? Is it a particular architecture? Is a framework made up of functions, or is it a library of functions? So the word gets used a lot, and what we want to do is kind of explain to you what a framework is, what it should be, and the benefits of a framework approach to automation. Now, if we look at the definition of framework, we see that the framework is an essential supporting structure of an object, as an object, or a basic structure underlying a system. Now, what's important is that this definition is not really about an automation framework. It's just a general definition for the word framework. And what's really interesting about this is that it's talking about the essential supporting structure. And that's what you need to think about when you're building a framework for automation. It's your core, it's your foundation for how you do automation. And that foundation, like in a building, needs to be rock solid and unmovable and unchangeable. So we need to have something that can be dependent on, that can be built on top of. Now, what are some characteristics that a framework needs to have? Well, the first one is reusability. It doesn't make sense to have a script be created with your automation only for that script to then go away the next time you're running tests to have to use a different script or different supporting framework. Maintainability. While it's great to have automated scripts run, you also need to be able to maintain them, because as your application changes, as your environment changes, you will always be tweaking and making updates to your automation, and your framework needs to be maintainable. Scalability. What does that mean? Well, often when we talk to people about the automation work that they've done, we often ask, well, how many scripts have you automated? Some people will say 50 or 60. Other people will say 1,000 or 2,000. To build something that allows you to execute and maintain several thousand scripts means having a scalable environment. And when you build a framework, it's important for it to be scalable. Extensibility. What that refers to is as your applications change and improve over time, as new features and functions are added to your application under test, your test automation and your framework needs to be able to support those. So extensibility is the ability to add features and functions to stay in step with your application under test. And finally, the concept of abstraction, where we don't want the data for your tests to be embedded with the automated tool. We want the data to actually be defined separately and outside of your automation, and then just have the automation act as an engine that pulls in that data, runs against the application, and provides reporting for you. For those of you who are familiar with ISTQB certifications, you may or may not be aware that there's a relatively new certification that has come out, and it's called the ISTQB Advanced Level Test Automation Engineer. That certification came out at the end of last year and is available in terms of examinations. We will be coming out with coursework for this in the next month or two. But basically what I wanted to show you is one of the diagrams from the syllabus from the Test Automation Engineer. The diagram that I'm referring you to here is called the Generic Test Automation Architecture, and it forms the basis of what the document describes as the different components that you need to be thinking about as you develop test automation and automation frameworks. As you'll notice, there's 4 levels or layers: a test generation layer, test definition layer, test execution layer, and test adaptation layer. Now, the 2 bottom layers are the ones that you're probably most familiar with. Adaptation being what it is that you're testing against, and then execution being your actual automation engine. So this is, again, best practices in test automation. With that, I will pass the presentation on to Pat Quilter. Pat, take it from here, please.
All right, thank you, Andrew. So what are Appium and Selenium exactly? Let's first start off with Selenium. And that would be the tool that we use when we want to automate web browsers. And those web browsers could be on desktops or they could be on mobile. And I can tell you, in the early days of Selenium, one of the most compelling capabilities, even compared to the expensive commercial automation tools, was its ability to record or write tests in Firefox on that browser and then be able to run on multiple browsers. And this was significant and still is significant because the users today are leveraging a lot of different browsers, and that keeps increasing. So test case execution needs to grow at the pace of modern browsers. And as a result, browser vendors are now taking steps to make Selenium a native part of their browser. So you may have heard of the interface called WebDriver, and this is what's meant by taking the Selenium components or Selenium native and including that in a browser. There's a protocol, if you will, that is now going to be, there's initiatives in place to put those in the most widely used browsers. And what this is going to do is provide a streamlined way for automation developers to now use outside processes. And when you think about outside processes, this just simply means the tools that we use to connect with WebDriver. So tools like Eclipse or IntelliJ, and then the programming languages that Selenium supports, like Java, C#, Ruby, JavaScript. These things all bind with the WebDriver interface, and they allow automation developers to drive test case steps. Now, Appium, on the other hand, is the tool we use to test on, to do automated tests on native mobile applications. So the applications that we download and install from the App Store. And similar to how single automated test cases in Selenium run on multiple browsers, an Appium test case, after careful analysis and design considerations, of course, that can be run on multiple devices and platforms like iOS and Android. So unlike other tools, Appium doesn't require any additional modules or agents to be added to the application itself. It actually leverages the testing capabilities that come with iOS and Android development kits. So this is somewhat unique. You don't have to ruin or potentially send out a production build with excess libraries and components compiled into it to make automation work. Appium kind of works outside of all of that. So pretty significant advantage there. And then Appium test cases can also be written in many of those popular programming languages. But on the whole, we find that Java is the most commonly used one. Now, on the next slide, we'll see here some of the considerations and how this actually compares to the commercial automation tools that are out there. So let's first talk about cost to implement. So we're talking about open source tools. So naturally, you might think, okay, we're eliminating licenses and maintenance fees and all of that. So we're already starting off with a win. But the reality is these tools, yeah, they're free and they're open source and you can do a lot of things with them, but that means you have to have a particular skill set. So things like developing in Java, all of a sudden could potentially cause a risk to losing the benefit that you're getting by using an open source product and eliminating the license. And if you take a comparison, perhaps many of the people on this presentation, if they've been doing automation as long as I have used a product called UFT, used to be called QTP. But if you think about that commercial product, it has a lot of user-friendly features already built into it. So you're paying for a license, but you're getting a lot of things out of the box that guide you in the automation development. Second thing about that product is that it uses the programming language VBScript, uses that scripting language, which is a lot more forgiving and a lot easier to comprehend than an object-oriented programming language like Java. So again, cost to implement, we shouldn't think of it as a complete deterrent from these open source tools, but we need to have a plan. So when would we want to use something like Appium and Selenium? And well, again, we already kind of said that Selenium is the tool we use if we were going to do something on web browsers, and we would choose Appium if we were going to work on mobile applications. And there's a little bit of gray area in the middle. Actually, both will work on a web application that runs in a mobile on a mobile device. So which one do you choose? Some things to consider there. So speaking from past experience, I found that if you were doing something like a responsive website, so a website that if I run it on a desktop, it presents one way. If I run it on a small little device, it is the same application, but it just shrinks down and shows me a different looking view of that application. And if you started with Selenium, there's really no need to move over to anything else or to pick Appium at that point, because you'd be in one tool and they port over nicely from desktop to mobile application web browser. On the flip side, if I was starting off from scratch and maybe my project requirement was to develop something on a native mobile application, and then there was a version of that, a native application, and there was a version of that application that's also in mobile web format, and I start off with Appium because that's the only way I can get to the native elements, I can continue to leverage Appium for my web testing. So there's a consideration there when you're thinking about when to use these and why you might want to use them. To speak to some of the limitations, well, the biggest one you can probably think of, we kind of touched upon this already, is that the commercial products typically come with some type of support, or you can purchase additional support tiers and go at your comfort level of how much you're going to need to leverage that support, and you have some assurance that you're going to get a response or a fix or a patch or some answer to whatever you're stumbling over at that time. Now, these open source products have support, but you're kind of at the mercy, and a lot of these are supported or helped out by a community. Community backs these open source tools, and you might have to wait for a response, which may or may not be desirable, or you're going to be spending a lot of time doing your own research and trying to figure out the problem yourself. So there is that particular limitation. And again, one of the things that we see that folks sometimes find challenging is keeping up with configurations and keeping libraries updated. New features for both Appium and Selenium come out quite frequently. Sometimes there's an advantage or a necessity to have to upgrade to the latest version. So having, again, the skill set or people on your team that can help you manage that becomes very important. If you don't have that, that could be viewed as some type of limitation. Whereas if you take a commercial product, a lot of that is handled already for you because there's a nice, neat package built-in installer that's doing all those things. And then finally, what organizations are using these tools today? So what we're seeing now is really organizations of all types and sizes. Selenium has been around longer, so it's not uncommon to go into an organization and see that they're using both commercial tools and Selenium at the same time, and they kind of complement each other and fill some gaps. And we're also seeing Selenium being pulled within commercial products to make their products a little bit better. So Selenium might be happening behind the scenes and you're not even realizing it. And then, of course, Appium provides a very compelling option for companies that are doing a lot of mobile app development, because their development teams can download it very quickly and set it up. Typically, they already have the skill set to utilize Appium because they're developing the applications themselves. So it's not a particularly big task for them to do it. So again, organizations that are enterprise organizations are starting to dabble in these tools. And certainly small organizations, these tools provide a great benefit because they can get their hands on them without having to go through lengthy purchase processes or trying to acquire a super amount of budget. And then the next slide here will take us to our demo and presentation. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to James Koch, who's going to show us some of these tools in action.
Sure, thanks, Patrick.
And we can see your screen.
Great. So I wanted to start off by showing Appium in the page object model. This is the framework. It's a very widely accepted framework with Appium and the Java client. Appium at its heart is a web server that exposes a REST API, and it uses HTTP JSON wire protocol to communicate between your test script, the actual server, and your test device. Right now I have this set up to run on Android. This is a real physical device, just mirrored. It's tethered to my laptop. And what you just saw me do was just start an Appium session. I'm making a connection between my test code in my IDE to my device via the Appium server. And the page object model, like we were saying, is it's the most widely accepted design pattern for Selenium. By itself, Selenium does not have an object repository concept. We need to create it ourselves. So each the page object model starts with two packages. We have a directory for pages and a directory for test. If you notice, each page in our application has a corresponding test page. So we can see my application, all of these objects make up the home page. On the home page, or make up the login page, sorry about that. So we can see the username field, the password field, the actual button to log in, and the title that's on the page. If you notice, this class is extended by a superclass. This is a subclass. On our superclass in this pages directory, this is where your program is always going to start. We have a constructor that we want to share across all of our classes. We also have a method that we want to use across all of our classes called take screenshot. Take screenshot has a method. It's based off of Selenium, the Selenium client, and we're able to capture a screenshot and save it to my local setup. And like I said, we want to be able to use that method, take screenshot, across all of our classes. So simply extending the base page will grab our constructor and allow us to use that take screenshot method. So to give you an understanding of our pages structure, we're finding and defining all of our objects for that particular page on our application page. We have our constructor, and we then have any methods that we can think of to test that particular page, the login page. So right off the bat, I can think of a few different methods. We have a correct login, which sends the correct username and password, a failed login because we sent a bad password, a failed login because we sent a correct password and a failed username, and then a failed username for both. That's the permutation of actions of just logging in. Those are all the different combinations that we can think of to test the login component of this application. So like I said, each page in our each page in our framework has a corresponding application page test. So here, this page is also a subclass of our test base. Our test base is where we're setting up the structure and the actual flow of our test. This method we have set up Appium is going to be shared across all of the classes in our test directory. The first thing we're doing is we're passing the server any capabilities that we want to use at run, or in this particular run. I've specified my device, the path to my application, our app package and activity. And we're passing all of these capabilities to our server, which is up and running at localhost 4723. Appium's listening at localhost 4723. We have a line that manages timeouts, right? Because we want to say if an object does not appear after 120 seconds, let's consider this a failure. Now, TestNG is the annotation framework that we use to control the flow of the tests. So we have it's not an extension of JUnit, but a lot of people are familiar with JUnit. It's very similar. I think it gives you a lot more capabilities, and it gives you a little bit more flexibility in allowing you to control your tests. So before the test, I'm setting up our test. After all of these tests execute, I can do some post actions, like removing the actual app from the device or just restarting the application. It's really whatever you want to do, and you set up that flow right through the test base. So like I said, these application page tests extend that test base. So any method like setup page in the before test, we need to we need that copy of it. Otherwise, you know, it'll throw errors. And we have our test tags. So before each test, we're instantiating the driver with the page object. Login page gives us access to all of the methods on the login page, like failed login, failed username, all of the objects individually. So if I want to verify that an object is displayed, I can do that, and I can call it from this page by using that object. So at our test tag, testng also allows you to give priority to specific tests, right? We wouldn't want to send the correct login right from the beginning, because then we obviously wouldn't be able to execute our other 3 tests. So we want to send all of our negative scenarios first. And the last thing it'll do is send our successful login. So I'm going to execute these and keep explaining them.
And while you're executing that, James, I'll just let everybody know that you're executing it on a local setup environment, and the application is going to run in a simulator.
Well, this is actually tethered to my. This is a mirror of my of my Samsung S5 Galaxy S5 that I have tethered to my laptop. So this is actually executing on a real physical device. But Patrick was mentioning, you know, you could spin this up on an emulator or a simulator. So right now you can see it's making those requests and it's sending those responses right back. So the first thing it's doing is it's sending the it's in the method to send the incorrect username and the correct password. Obviously, this should not take us to the home screen, and that's what the test case is verifying, that when we click the login button, we stay on the home screen. So while that's running, we could see the results being come pouring in. One by one, it just sent the failed login, and I'll change my perspective so we can see the actual device and our results being compiled. So it just ran the second method, failed login, and it passed because it stayed on the login screen. Now, what happens when we send a successful login? It should be we should be directed to the home page, and on the home page we have an object that it's the title, and we're doing some verification that when we do send a correct login, you're taken to the home page, and the home page is giving you the correct string. So it's executing right now, the successful login. Sending my correct parameters, which the login is A and A. Great. So let's look at that method, successful login, on the login page. We didn't really do any verification. All we did was we sent the correct username, we sent the correct password field, and then we're clicking the login button. On the actual home page test, we want to make sure that we're not, we want to make sure that we're sending our correct login before the test. So if this does fail, it's a failure of the before test in the setup page method. It's not a failure of the home page. So to do that, we've instantiated both pages, and we've created an object for login page and home page. So this test, it's going to run that correct login method before we hit the test tag. Once we are on the home page, then we can check for the home page title. So if you see, my results came pouring in for the last test that I did for the login page, and all tests passed, 4 for 4. So when I kick off the home page, let's observe the behavior. So I just started a new Appium session. And we could see slowly but surely we're passing our test parameters, our desired capabilities to the Appium server. The Appium server is saying, okay, this application is installed on the phone. So let's launch the main activity. So we can see we're not in the actual test tag yet. If there was a failure in the correct login method, we would know when we're debugging exactly where to look. So we're sending the request, got a response back. So we sent the request, get the object, and get the text value from it. Does it compare to the return? Yes, it does. It compares successfully. You have logged in. If this text was off in any way, if our expected message was you have logged in, welcome, and I ran this, it would obviously fail because our strings do not match. So that's just one way we can add validation to our tests. And this framework was all executed using Android find by and the Appium driver. Well, we can Selenium, its parent, if you will, allows you to do the same concept, the same page object model for web browsers. But this time, as opposed to using Android capabilities, the Android find by and subclassing element and classifying these elements as mobile elements, we're finding elements just using the find by technique and classifying them as a web element. So this might look familiar to you if you've ever used UFT, the Mercury Tours demo website. That's what we're going to be using. We can see we're on the home page now. In the page object model structure, we want to be recording every single one of these objects that we're going to be manipulating first. And then any method that we can think of to test. So, sorry, home page. We have our username field, our password field, maybe the featured destination, and even the web table that is on the home page. We can analyze this web table right here to make sure, okay, do we get the correct response? You know, this website is static, so there's not too much validation, but we're just getting these objects and A, making sure they are appearing correctly, and then B, making sure that they conduct their function correctly. And we do that through the methods. So we have a method that says check the home page for exception. Is everything displayed? Great. We have a method for successful login, failed login, and then that web table test I was telling you about. Keeping so our menu options are going to be shared across all of these. So this would be a good example of how we can use all of these objects and set them once. We don't want to be finding and locating the register button every single time we want to click that object. So we put it in a class to itself, and we can test the menu tray. We can test it by checking all of the objects from top down or from the side over. And by keeping this structure, let's say our test is filling out the form of the register page. So my first action was I navigated to the website, Mercury Tours demo AUT, right? My next action is to click the register tab, and then I can start filling out the form. Well, if I clicked the register button and I was not directed to the register page, is that a failure of the register page? No, it is a failure of the menu options class. So we do the same exact thing we had set up for mobile. In the before test, we're setting up capabilities. With Selenium by itself, we have a Chrome driver. We're using Chrome. If we were passing Firefox driver, we would use Gecko driver. Managing timeouts, and the same thing. We're initializing each page that we want to use. We're navigating to the website, and then we're using the menu options object, register tab is what we called it, to do a click. From there, after we click, then we can come in and start filling out our form. And a little bit of what that looks like. We're able to send keys to a particular object. We're able to create a select object based on a drop-down. And we can use that drop list object to find elements. We can find elements by visible text. So when I click the actual drop-down, United States is visible. So all of these would be visible text. I could also find things by index. So I can find things by, all right, if I want to choose Albania, that's index 0. Droplet. So yes, there's plenty of techniques that Selenium comes built in with that in order to add validation or in order to do new actions. So I'll kick this test off, this register page test, and show what that looks like. All right, it opened up my browser, it went to the site, it clicked the register, and it filled out the form just like that in the blink of an eye. We can add some post actions if we want to the register page test. So let's say we want to close the browser after each one. So I'm going to add after test, public void teardown, right? Because this is the action that we're using to tear down our test case. Driver.quit. So now when I run this exact same test case, after it's done filling out the form, we should be quitting the application, or we should be quitting the browser. So again, I'm running this as a test-ng test. And it closes the browser for me. So this is just one example of how you can set up a framework. 76% of people are using the Java client with Selenium, and this is an incredibly scalable type of framework. For instance, when it comes to the mobile, I read that Yahoo tests about 10,000 tests per day in the Sauce Labs platform. So they're deploying their application tests to multiple different devices and testing against fragmentation. One other way we can test this out, another framework design, is through something called the keyword-driven framework. And what the keyword-driven framework does is it reads in a data sheet that outlines our tests. So we're separating the data from the code completely. This is my data sheet, and I can I'm using this as just a Java application. I have an executioner that I'm running. This is our main class. And it's doing the menu tray tests, followed by a homepage test that logs us in. And it's as simple as updating a spreadsheet if I want to add any methods, or so if I want to close the browser after this test, close browser. I'm going to save it. And again, I've completely separated my data. My action is click a button, or my action is open the browser at a specific target. If I want to run it on IE, I just simply change my test data to say IE, or Firefox, or Opera, whatever your browser is. Enter URL, that's whatever I'm going to. Click this particular button with the Selenium locator link text, the locator value, enter text data. I could also have a method for enter numeric data if we want. And close browser is its own method in itself. So now when I run this keyword framework, the last step should close my, my second TC2. Great, test case 1 is executing. Now in the blink of an eye, I just tested the sign-on actions, just like that. Why I think this is really good, right now my data sheet is hard-coded in to my program, but if I wanted to, I can just simply pass a command line argument if I package up this whole program as a jar. So I'm going to pass it back over to Patrick if he wants to elaborate a little bit on the keyword driven.
Yeah, James, I just wanted to piggyback onto your point here. First of all, I think you did a great job of hammering home that, you know, we're looking at a Java environment, but it is, if we have a structure like POM or a structure like the keyword driven framework here, it gives us a strategy to work within something that we might find hard, especially if we're moving away from automation tools like UFT that use VB script, and we have to use more of a real robust programming language. Last point I just wanted to make on here is the keyword driven approach. In order to make this work, maybe like something that you've seen in UFT, we're using a technique or something called Java reflection. So this would not work without Java reflection. All Java reflection does is it allows us at runtime to interface with any of the fields or the methods that James has created. And the other important thing we like is that we can actually build starting with a POM structure and move our way into a keyword driven framework. So again, starting with POM first and then switching to keyword. Now you might say, why would we want to do something like this? Well, POM is really nice in the beginning when you're developing an application and your developers are changing things all the time. They're moving objects around, they're maybe moving objects onto different pages, and you need a strategy for keeping up with their changes so that you can keep your automated scripts intact. So POM is really nice for that. But at the same time, eventually the application becomes much more stable, and in which case regression testing becomes more desirable. And in that case, we can switch to a keyword approach. And the biggest thing that we can piggyback onto is the fact that in our POM structure, we're centralizing all of our objects. We have something that serves like the object repository in UFT. And that is maintained. We can continue to leverage that. And we simply just introduce the concept of Java reflection and then recode our methods to work with that Java reflection. So again, these are the implementations of those good ideas Andrew was talking about from a framework perspective in the beginning. And I'm going to hand it back over to Andrew now just to wrap up some of these benefits again.
Thanks, Pat. Thanks, James. Wanted to also point out that the things James was showing you in terms of the structure of how he had everything in there really talks to reliability of the code base. It talks to reusability. If you have everything nicely structured and it can be reused time and time again, it talks to the maintainability of your code so that as you have changes that need to be made to your test automation environment, they're easy to do. And of course, the extensibility that you can add additional information there. Now, one thing that I'd like to have you all think about is the essential elements of a framework and what really we need to build into that. And James alluded to it in several ways by showing you inputting, navigating by clicking on links, validating, and then there's synchronizing. So if you think about those 4 elements, those are things that are typically coded into a framework because those are the 4 essential elements that you need for a framework to have.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and summarize here. So what we've just gone over, hopefully by now we all understand that the open source tools are here and they're probably here to stay. And we talked about small organizations and large organizations using them, blending them into what they have, and it provides a great option, especially saving costs, at least on the acquiring the tool side. There's a large community support and enhancement capabilities. So for Selenium on the web, it's seleniumhq.org and appium.io. And here, this is where you get the latest version updates. You see the latest news of what's going on, the roadmap of where the community is driving the new capabilities. And this at least also provides a way to get yourself started. And if you need any questions answered, at least you can start here to submit them and hope you get a response back from the community. We can see that it's more technically challenging than some of the commercial products. But again, if we truly want to realize the benefit of being able to eliminate licensing costs, we just need a plan. And we need to assess, probably internally, to see where our skill set is, what we're going to need to make these open source products work. And if they don't already exist, maybe we need to go out and get some training. The other thing is we want to stick to adhere to guidance, and that's what's going to give us longevity in these tools and make us successful. Bottom line here is really the automation tools over the years, what they provide hasn't really changed. The tools have changed, but the discipline in implementing those tools to make it successful has not. And as Andrew just mentioned, the thing that really drives it home is having a framework. And this is one of those disciplines that if you're developing a maintainable framework with specific attributes, it doesn't matter which tool you're using. And Andrew is going to finish up here with last thoughts and give you some other resources to think about.
Thank you, Pat. So I know that when you were looking at the presentation of the live tools that James was giving on both Appium and Selenium, I know that there's a number of you who saw the Java code and understood it implicitly. Then there's a group of you who have done some automation with some other programming languages that probably could recognize what was going on. And then there's probably also a subset of the folks on the call that really have not done much with automation and who don't have very strong technical skills. And you probably looked at that and were really wondering, how am I going to get my head around this? And we understand that, there's a lot of resources out there on the web. Pat indicated which sites you can go to for that. But in addition to all of that information, we as a company focusing and specializing on testing have created a 4-day workshop that really takes you from basic fundamental information about how to install and configure the tool to actually developing a framework. Why? Because we know that when you finish coming out of training, you need to be able to have the tools to be able to then keep going at your work site to actually implement it. And that's why the workshops are all about knowing everything you need to know about the tools, including starting to create an automated framework. Number 2 is a lot of organizations that give training require everybody to install all the software on their own laptops or work machines. And what ends up happening, well, everybody wastes half a day trying to get all the machines configured. So what we've done is said, you know what, for training purposes, we're going to provide each student in the workshop their own pre-configured environment. It's going to have every single application and product that needs to be on there configured properly so we don't waste time. In addition, we'll also provide you with all the instructions on how to install that correctly. Then we talked about framework skills. That's an important part of learning how to use a tool, not just about features and functions. And we do this at our public training facilities, both in the DC metro area here in Chevy Chase, Maryland, and in Denver, Colorado. But for those people that can't travel or don't have a travel budget, we offer the same instruction live with the same images for students to use from a remote location. So you don't lose anything out. We still get you the training manual, etc. And finally, for those clients that are really looking for implementation expertise, we can actually help implement the tools either by providing training on site or by providing consulting services, however much you may need. So as we're winding down, what I'd like to do is move this on to our Q&A. I know that some people have already asked some questions. Feel free to use the chat box to submit your question, and we will take the last few moments here of our webinar to address your concerns as well. We do have the contact information here. Should you need any more details, any other questions, please feel free to send us an email, to give us a call, and we can follow up. So right now, we'll take any questions that you have. Dave?
Yeah, Andrew. Yeah, here's the first question that has come in.
Sure.
Can test scripts from Selenium be used in HP UFT and vice versa?
Pat, you want to take that one?
Yeah, not naturally. Meaning I certainly couldn't open up a Java Selenium script inside of UFT and hope that it works right. Same because it's a completely different language. So the UFT is expecting VB script. However, there are new versions of the UFT product, or that HP has created, that do leverage or integrate with Selenium. So if you've heard of Lean UFT, that would be the direction that you're starting to go in. If you wanted to start blending those tools even more succinctly than running them in separate types of tools.
The other thing I would add to that is that if you have been using with either tool a data-driven or a keyword-driven framework approach, then a lot of your data for your test cases has already been externalized, and we know how good that is because that talks to the concept of abstraction that we covered earlier. So if that's the case, then by having that data already external to the particular engine, automation engine, that would make it easier to then try to adapt that same data for those test cases across different test automation engines.
Good. I think that helps a lot. Another question is, can you speak more about TestNG? What's the difference between that and JUnit?
James Koch, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think that TestNG is a lot more powerful of an annotation framework. Not only because of the verbiage, you can do things before each individual method. You can do things before the test tag. You can do things also, it gives you the ability, TestNG does, it gives you the ability to send parameters via an XML file to your test. So that's another way of separating data from code. I think it all around, like I said, TestNG was not built on top of, but it was inspired by JUnit. It encompasses everything JUnit does, but it gives you a lot more functionality.
Okay, good. Another question for you. Can you run both iOS tests and Android tests in parallel?
Well, yes. You know, you're going to need separate Appium sessions. Obviously, an automation run with Appium is always started, and they all have a unique session ID. So yes, it is completely possible to execute a test on an iOS and an Android device in parallel.
Okay, good. And then we just have a couple of minutes left, so I suppose this could be a very long answer, but are there any reports that Appium generates?
That Appium generates, well, yeah, you can get the whole console output gets put into a log file. So that's really useful for somebody like me when I have my automation developers running things and saying, okay, you know, this object just, you know, this part of the test keeps on failing. Well, if you send me the Appium log, I'm able to get into it and see, okay, what failed? What were my actual capabilities, right? We're sending the server desired capabilities and we're getting a response back with the actual capabilities. So that report is really useful. But again, that's not necessarily a results report. TestNG gives you some really nice results back after the execution, down to how many milliseconds it took to execute, how many tests passed, how many failed, as well as the specific line of your program. And that makes it really easy to debug. So again, if something fails in my before test, my TestNG report will tell me, okay, you failed setting up the test.
Okay, good. Andrew, that's really all that we have time for right now. Any closing thoughts or comments? Any plans for future webinars?
Well, first of all, thank you all for attending. Appreciate giving us an opportunity to talk in depth about Appium and Selenium and frameworks and how everything kind of comes together. I hope it's been informational and educational, and we're here to help. You know, we've been doing this for almost 25 years now, working with automated tools and improving the test process. So look forward to hearing from you. And we will be having some other webinars in the future. We'll announce those via distribution through our social media. So we look forward to having you join those as well.
All right, thanks, gentlemen. Great job today, and we look forward to hearing from you again in the future. Thanks, everyone.